The world never imagined that Steve Irwin, the fearless crocodile hunter who seemed invincible in the wild, would meet his end in such a tragic way. On September 4th, 2006, Steve was underwater, exploring the Great Barrier Reef for what should have been just another day of filming. But it wasn't. On that day, he never returned to the surface alive. His final moments, captured in silence beneath the waves, shocked the world and left millions grieving. To understand the weight of that moment, we need to go back in time and see who Steve truly was. Stephen Robert Irwin was born on February 22, 1962. His childhood was unlike most. While other children played with toy trucks or dolls, Steve was surrounded by snakes, lizards, and crocodiles. His parents, Bob and Lynn, ran a small reptile and fauna park in Queensland, and young Steve practically grew up inside it. At the age of 6, he was given a 12-foot scrub python for his birthday. By 9, he had already wrestled his first crocodile under his father's supervision. These weren't isolated experiences, they shaped him. From an early age, Steve wasn't just curious about animals, he was drawn to them in a way that few could understand. While most people shuddered at the sight of a reptile, Steve was fascinated. He had what you could call an insatiable thirst to learn more, to understand their behaviors, their instincts, and their role in nature. The bond he developed with wildlife wasn't manufactured for television. It was real, lifelong, and deeply personal. As he grew, so did his purpose. Steve took over the family's park, eventually renaming it Australia Zoo. Around this time, fate brought him together with Terri Irwin, an American naturalist who would become not only his wife, but his partner in adventure. Their honeymoon didn't involve beaches or luxury hotels. Instead, they spent it capturing crocodiles together, and the footage from that trip became the very first episode of what would become a global phenomenon: the Crocodile Hunter. With his boundless energy, his broad Australian accent, khaki shorts, and his trademark crikey, Steve captivated audiences everywhere. The Crocodile Hunter wasn't just another wildlife documentary. It was a window into a world that many were too afraid to look at closely. Viewers weren't just watching Steve handle animals, they felt as though they were right there beside him, teetering between awe and fear. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Steve Irwin was an international star. His show aired in over 130 countries, reaching hundreds of millions of people. Yet despite the fame, Steve never lost sight of his mission. He often said, "I consider myself a wildlife warrior. My mission is to save the world's endangered species." He purchased vast areas of land across Australia, Fiji, Vanuatu, and the United States to protect habitats. Through his foundation, Wildlife Warriors, he fought against poaching, land clearing, and the destruction of ecosystems. For Steve, conservation wasn't a side project. It was the heartbeat of his life. Behind the larger-than-life television persona, he was also a devoted husband and father. His children, Bindi and Robert, were at the center of his world. More than once, he said that fatherhood was his proudest achievement. He wanted to raise them not just to love animals, but to continue his mission long after he was gone. In fact, by 2006, he was already developing a new program called Bindi the Jungle Girl to help his daughter step into that role. That year, his work took him out onto the open waters of Queensland, where he was filming a new documentary called Ocean's Deadliest. The production had been slowed by bad weather, and while waiting for the skies to clear, Steve looked for ways to make the most of the downtime. Always eager to contribute, he decided to film some additional material for Bindi's show. Compared to his usual encounters with crocodiles or venomous snakes, this plan seemed far less risky. He would wade into shallow water to film sea life, including creatures often thought of as gentle and harmless. It felt safe. almost routine. On the morning of September 4th, at Bat Reef near Port Douglas, Steve slipped into the water. The sea was calm, the kind of day perfect for filming. With his cameraman close by, he swam slowly into chest-deep waters, careful not to disturb the ocean floor. As he hovered above a large, graceful shape gliding along the sand, everything seemed peaceful. It was a short-tailed stingray, nearly 2 meters across, moving with quiet elegance. But in an instant, peace gave way to tragedy. Steve had been positioning himself for a clean shot at the stingray as it swam gracefully away. Then something changed. Perhaps it was the sudden outline of his shadow. Maybe just a flicker of instinctive fear. Whatever the trigger, the stingray reacted. In a split second, the animal propped itself upward and whipped its tail with explosive force. Stingrays are not aggressive by nature, but when they feel cornered, their defense is swift and brutal. The tail carried a serrated barb, sharp as a blade and nearly as long as a man's forearm. It struck with precision, plunging straight into Steve's chest. At first he thought it was his lung. The sharpness of the blow, the searing pain, the sudden rush of breath leaving his body all suggested a punctured lung. But the truth was far worse. The barb had pierced his heart, tearing into the very organ that kept him alive. The wound was catastrophic, the kind of injury that leaves almost no chance of survival, even with immediate medical help. Blood began to fill his chest cavity with every heartbeat. Breathing became nearly impossible, each gasp shorter than the last. For Steve, the ocean that had felt calm only moments before had suddenly become an unforgiving trap. His body was fighting to stay conscious, while his crew watched in horror, trying to process what had just happened. The crocodile hunter, who had faced down the most dangerous creatures on Earth, had been brought down by a single, desperate strike from an animal that wasn't meant to kill. His crew pulled him from the water and began CPR, rushing him back toward their boat in a frantic attempt to save him. But by the time they reached the nearest island for medical help, it was too late. Steve Irwin had taken his last breath. He was just 44 years old. The news of his death spread instantly, stunning the world. Steve Irwin, the man who had stared down crocodiles, handled venomous snakes, and faced danger with a grin, was gone. And what made it all the more shocking was the cause. Not a ferocious predator, but a stingray, an animal few considered dangerous, had ended the crocodile hunter's life. Tributes poured in. Australian Prime Minister John Howard called him a wonderful and colorful son. Flags were lowered to half-mast across the country. In the United States and beyond, Discovery and Animal Planet aired special tributes. Fans flocked to Australia Zoo, leaving flowers, letters, and mementos. The world had lost not just a television personality, but a man who had made nature accessible, exciting, and beloved. His funeral was private, as his family wished. A state funeral was offered, but declined. His father, Bob, said Steve would have wanted to be remembered as an ordinary bloke. Later that month, a public memorial was held at the Crocoseum, his zoo's great arena. Broadcast worldwide, it reached hundreds of millions. Celebrities and friends spoke, but it was 8-year-old Bindi's words that cut deepest. She stood bravely before the crowd and said she didn't want her father's passion to ever end. And it hasn't. Australia Zoo continues to thrive, run by Terri, Bindi, and Robert. Wildlife Warriors supports global conservation. Each year, on November 15th, Steve Irwin Day is celebrated, honoring his mission on the birthday of one of his favorite animals, a 175-year-old Galapagos tortoise named Harriet. His legacy endures not just in programs and projects, but in the millions of people he inspired to care about wildlife. Steve once said that when he looked into the eyes of an animal, he saw life, love, and the future of the planet. That was who he was. His death was tragic, but it wasn't meaningless. He showed the world that animals, even the ones we fear, deserve our respect. Nature is breathtaking, but it is also unpredictable. Steve Irwin's story reminds us that exploring it can bring both wonder and risk. And sometimes, as it was for him, it can mean your last moment on Earth.